Inflation is weird and it's confusing because we'll have years of nothing and then one day all of a sudden, boom, we are having massive inflation and it's a big problem. Even though we knew we were fueling the problems that would eventually cause inflation for years, decades even. But it doesn't show up until it shows up, and now it's here. And because it's been so long since we've had any real inflation like this, we're struggling with what to do. And not just you and me, but the central banks included. They don't actually know what they're doing. I mean, they're trying, but it's not an easy job. So one of the things that we do to try and figure out what to do in this current period is to look back at the past. And the last time we had inflation like this was in the 1970s. So let's take a look at what happened in the 70s and whether it is actually similar to what's happening today. So of course I got our research from Macro Ops like always. This is our global macro research and consulting firm, if you didn't know, because I say it every video. But what went on in the 1970s? Because that was a period of massive inflation. Well, it was actually demographic changes that caused much of that 70s inflation. And that higher demand ended up pushing prices up. Because if you have demand rising and you have the same amount of supply or even less supply, what's going to happen to the price of those goods? It's going to shoot up. And when it shoots up, that can be considered inflation. So what happened in the 70s is that we saw the entry of the baby boomers, women, and minorities into the workforce. This happened in the late 60s and early 70s. So this is a lot of people that weren't working before. So it was a massive change in the labor force. And when these guys came into the labor force, they obviously needed things to go to work, right? They needed tools, they needed suits, they needed a place to live, they needed apartments, houses, cars, dishwashers, TVs, all of that. This is why economies love jobs, right? People get paid and then they spend that money, which creates more jobs. One person's spending is another person's income. That's why you get virtuous boom cycles. And then when things turn around, you could get a cycle downwards. So for example, right now, if we went into a recession and less people spend money, then what happens? You start seeing job cuts because one person's spending is another person's income, right? So you can get a cycle up and a cycle down. But anyway, that boom in the workforce is what caused the inflation back in the 70s. But today, we're actually seeing the complete opposite phenomenon occur. We're seeing the labor force's growth rate actually slow down, not speed up. And in our case, global demographics are actually declining. That's why Elon Musk is single-handedly trying to impregnate every woman in the world. That way we could bring that population back up. I don't know if you saw this fact in the news, but Elon Musk's dad got his stepdaughter pregnant. For the second time, I think it was. And this is a stepdaughter he's raised since she was 4 years old. So Elon has 10 kids now and his dad has 8? Well, hopefully they solve inflation, I guess. But anyway, like I said, we're seeing the labor force growth rate actually slow, not speed up. And that's because we just haven't had baby booms anymore, unless you're a Musk. But what is interesting is our general demand dynamics. Because even though our workforce isn't increasing, demand has risen simply because we've had lump sum payments to people, like stimulus checks. And everyone has higher savings rates right now as well. So with more money and the same amount of goods or even less goods, what happens? Again, prices go up, right? That's inflation. So one of the similar things that's happening now compared to the 70s is that some of this money has been poured into purchasing durable goods, like washing machines, refrigerators, TVs, etc. Yet the big difference remains that demographics are not playing a role like they did in the 70s. So it's different. The next area we could look at is energy and food shocks. So back in the 70s, United States and most of the developing world actually went through a bad patch of weather, which disrupted the food supply around the globe. That's how bad the weather was. So that led the cost of food to rise by 20% in 1973 and then another 12% in 1974. Now in this case, there is a similarity between then and now. So in 73, if you go back and look at the inflation numbers, including food and energy, it was a whopping 5.7%. But when you exclude energy and food, it's only less than 2%. And that's what's happening today too. The year-over-year CPI inflation rate was 9.1% in June, but the core rate was just under 6%. So as you know, food and gas have been a problem. Restaurants are getting real expensive. I've seen some of my favorite places raise prices by 33%. There's this little French bakery that sells these amazing pastries. They used to be $6, now they're $8. That's a big increase. And gas, you already know how bad gas is. It cost me like $70 to $80 just to fill up a tank. Rough. So in the 73 through the 75 period, about 5 percentage points of inflation was caused by food prices. So it's a huge factor, of course. Now the second big shock in the same period was the 1973 energy shock. And this is where OPEC allowed the price of imported oil to quadruple within a few months. Gas back then got real expensive too. And like I said, inflation is weird, it's tough to predict, and it's hard to control, right? Well, in the 70s, it became real interesting because in the mid-70s, inflation disappeared by itself. Like it just disappeared. But then it came came back again, and that happened in the later 70s. So for example, food went up 29% in price in the early to mid 70s, and then another 22% in the late 70s. And actually a lot of this inflation was driven by meat price dynamics, because there was the biggest drop in cattle population in the history of America, over 16%. Now there are some similarities to today, because there has been large underinvestment in oil production. And if you've been watching our videos for a few years, you know we've tracked that off and on. Not enough capital expenditure in the oil space. And because of that, there have been price spikes. In a similar fashion to the bad weather and bad cattle things that happened back in the 70s, we've gotten supply shocks now too. It's important to remember that Russia and Ukraine are large suppliers to the grain markets. Russia is a huge fertilizer producer. They produce about 50 to 65% of global ammonium nitrate supply. That's a lot. They also contain a bunch of supply chains for energy, especially in Europe. So you can see what happened to European natural gas prices here because of this whole conflict. And you can see the rapid increase in food prices in the US. In June 21, the index was at 276, and now it's at 305. That's a 10% increase year over year. That's huge. Now, another thing we could look at in the 70s was policy changes. So Nixon actually put in price and wage controls back in the day, and it was actually responsible for the inflation of non-food and non-energy goods. This was the US's first and only attempt at running a wage price control policy in peacetime when Nixon announced his 3-month-long freeze in August 1971. So all that this did was actually lower inflation during periods of low inflation anyway, and then elevate it during periods of high inflation. So it basically made the cycles worse. So he pretty much had controls in place, right, that temporarily caused prices to remain stable for some time. So if there was no control, the cost would have risen by 10% annually for 2 years. So it would go from 100 to 110 to 121. But instead, because they had the controls in place, this turned into the price jumping from 100 to 121 in just 1 year. So really it kind of backfired, because even though it wasn't as directly crucial as food shocks, it still helped accentuate the level of inflation in the 70s. Now, is that going to happen again? Is the government going to come in and try to control it? Well, we see the beginnings of some government policy today, but they're just trying to find a solution. I think what we saw Biden tweeting, telling gas station owners to not increase prices of gas, as if they have control over it. But another thing to consider is that a significant cause of today's inflation is driven by supply chain blockages. And these same types of supply chain blockages didn't exist back in the 70s. It was a different world. So to conclude, when talking about today's inflation versus the 70s, today's is very different. So any comparison to the 70s should be taken with a grain of salt. There are some parallels, but there's a lot more differences. So how do you play a market like this? Well, in our case at Fallible, we're sticking to our system that works through any environment. And if you want to learn how that system works, make sure you check out our free training right here. It'll show you all the rules so that you can do it yourself. I'm going to put a link to this page where you could sign up for this free training in this video and down below in the description and comments. And yeah, this period in our economic history is like nothing we've experienced before. And that's exactly what Stan Druckenmiller was saying. And we go over what the GOAT of investing said in this video right here. He talks about why now is so different and how he's managing it. So definitely check out that video after you check out our training by clicking right here. Do that, and I'll see you over in that other video.